Good evening to one and all present. I welcome you all to the 5th day of the international webinar series on protecting breastfeeding, a shared responsibility, organized by the Department of Foods and Nutrition, Department of Foods and Nutrition Alumni Association, and WBW Alliance Vadodara chapter. The topic of today is nutrition and growth in NICU. And today's speaker is Dr. Sonya Misra from United States of America. I would now like to invite our chairperson for today's session, Professor Meenakshi Mehan, Head Department of Foods and Nutrition and President of Foods and Nutrition Alumni Association, to introduce our today's speaker.
Good morning, Sonia, and good evening to all my national local participants here. It's a pleasure to once again invite Sonia for our Breastfeeding Week celebrations and look forward to a wonderful presentation from her. Let me introduce her. She is an associate professor in Stanford University School of Medicine. She is a Delhiite, and she earned her medical degree from University of Delhi in 1991. And she is also a recipient of Lieutenant Governor's Award for the Best All-Round Medical Student in Delhi. She completed her pediatric training in Loyola University at Chicago in 1995. And completed her fellowship in neonatology at Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital and her master's in public health at Columbia University in New York in 1998. She joined the neonatal division of SCVMC. I don't know what is this. Sonia, maybe you could elaborate. In 2000 as an attending physician and has been here ever since. She is the chairperson of the Enterprise Interdisciplinary Practice Committee, co-chair of the Infant and Children's Bioethics Committee, and a member of SCCMA Ethics Committee. Over the years, she has worked to improve infant outcomes with an emphasis on non-invasive ventilation and nutrition. She has been the lead of the nutrition team Ignite to help improve growth. She was part of the team that helped lead St. Louis Regional Hospital to a baby-friendly designation in 2015. Her research interests are in growth and development with an emphasis on body composition of preterm infants and factors modifying it. So I think all the nutrition students, doctors are also there, but for us, it is going to be a very informative, interesting, and a lot of learnings we can look forward to for this session on nutrition in NICU units and support of growth. So over to you, Dr. Sonia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm completely honored for this opportunity to speak at this August conference that you're holding here. I know this has been a difficult year since we last spoke, and I'm very sorry if any of you have had sad things happen in your life. I want us to spend this next hour, however, focusing on the future, which is what we see and what we hope will happen with what we do with our children. So my absolute obsession is growth and development. And I absolutely love my premature infants. I should let you know up front because that will come up during this 1 hour talk several times. And I really do think that the most important intervention that we can do in the NICU is to get that mother working with us and provide breast milk for us. So I tailored this talk a little bit more towards everyone who listens to this talk. I hope you will walk away realizing that breast milk is the most important food for these children and want to convince these mothers into it because it takes our conviction to convince a mother to go through the difficult time of pumping and sharing her milk with her child. So I need to figure out how I'm going to change a slide. Are you sharing, or it looks like I'm sharing, right? Okay, next slide. Okay, so I have really nothing to disclose but my aims, and to discuss human milk as the optimal food for our infants. I discuss changes created by pasteurization. My understanding is that some units in India are actually pressure cooking the milk to sterilize it. And I just want you to be aware of the changes that this brings about to the milk, and so how we can sort of try to balance out those unique problems. These children are not like term infants. They're all in different stages of development. Malnutrition interferes with not just the body growth, but with entire organ to support life. And I feel like we have a responsibility to try and mitigate some of those injuries, not only by trying to reduce those therapies, but also by possibly nutrition or other things that we could do to combat that iatrogenic damage. We may already have had a small size in utero. Many of our children come out to us a little smaller, SGA, as they're byproducts of difficult pregnancies. There's a separation of the dyad. The mother and child are apart. They're sad. This may not be as much of an issue in India. I understand a lot more kangaroo care is there than here. There is immature immune function in the premature infant, and we are unable to use the gut immediately. Often it needs, especially if they're under 34 weeks. Over 34 weeks, the gut looks, somewhat similar to that of an older child, but under that, we need to sort of prepare that gut to accept the nutrition. So I am going to focus this talk a little bit more on enteral nutrition than parenteral. The other concept we have to always keep at the back of our mind is that these children are missing part of their third trimester. That means somewhere between 28 and 40 weeks. And you all know our kids are born during that time. At this time in pregnancy, about 70 to 80% of the calcium, 90% of the phosphorus, very long chain fatty acids and fat soluble vitamins, 60% of the iron are all deposited during this period of time. So if you miss parts of your third trimester, you're going to miss parts of this deposition that you would be expecting to have. And that lack, if we can't make up for it with our nutrition, can lead to long-term issues. Calcium and phosphorus lead to rickets of prematurity. Long chain fatty acids may lead to reduced brain volumes. Fat soluble vitamins, the same thing. And again, if we don't have enough iron, everyone knows iron deficiency, anemia leads to all kinds of problems. So I'm used to speaking to neonatologists. If I'm telling you guys something you already know and don't want to hear, somebody put a hand up and I can move on to something else. So bottom line is responsibility of supporting growth is absolutely huge. Everything we do has an impact for a very long time. Mother's breast milk, however, is the cornerstone of neonatal nutrition. It's not just nutrition. It is what I consider all nutrition, a reactive biological system. I think too often it's considered food and nothing but food, but it is actually medication. The mother must be told this to encourage her to continue to pump and hand express, which is very difficult for her, often with all the other responsibilities she has. But this is essential for her child. The AAP came out in 2012 in the favor of breast milk, finally. Donor breast milk was considered better than formula simply because it was considered the same as breast milk. In 2016, they modified it slightly. They said the mother's milk is always preferred, but in part because some of the breast milk's biological benefits may be reduced after pasteurization. But donor milk is an effective alternative when the mother's milk is not pregnant. I've got it on the mind, I think. So WHO 2019, their last statement also recommends that low birth weight infants should be fed their mother's own milk. And when a mother's milk is not available, the alternatives, they give you the option of donor milk as well as formula. Available evidence shows that compared with formula, donor milk is associated with lower incidence of the severe gut disorder, necrotizing enterocolitis, and other infections. And this is something that we're going to focus on a little bit in our conversation today. Okay, so let me see here. So what are the, let's go back. All right, so what are the benefits? So when the AAP was coming up with these recommendations, they looked at several papers, and I was just going to list some of those papers for you. They look a little bit on the older side, but simply because they were the ones that convinced people. I'm sorry. All right, so were you trying to tell me something, or is someone discussing dinner? Which I hope you're all eating, and I hope this is good dinner conversation. Benefits in the preterm infant, they thought breast milk compared to formula, we had decreased rates of late onset sepsis and necrotizing enterocolitis. Now, this is a word, I don't know how familiar people are with this, but this is a disease where you have a normal prenatal, you have a normal preterm infant, and for some reason, usually bacterial overgrowth. We think dysbiosis is a start at this point for it. And it starts out a cascade of thrombosis, and parts of the intestinal wall die and undergo necrosis. And this air collects with underneath the surface of the intestinal wall. And you end up seeing, like we see here, this sort of bubbly appearance on the outside of the intestine, as you can see, because the infection would sometimes go all the way through the wall of the intestine. So in the early stages, it's just a bloody stool, but later on, it goes on to leading to complete ileus. And then, the process is the infant ends up being NPO for days and dependent on parenteral nutrition that we're still not that fantastic at. And then suffers great problems with growth, long-term malabsorption issues, strictures in the future, possible surgeries. And many times they simply pass away if their intestine is affected from beginning to end, or they perforate and you need a surgeon. And in many parts of the world, that simply equates with death. So other important benefits are severe retinopathy of prematurity is prevented by providing breast milk, mother's breast milk to the child, fewer rehospitalizations in the first year of life. Now we're looking out at the future. You've got results that are not just in the short term for the preterm infant, but we're looking at long-term things that are going to affect the parents and their home, improve neurodevelopmental outcomes. We'll talk about all these in detail later. Lower rates of metabolic syndrome. I looked to see what proof we had of this, and we have some, but the original studies, lower rate of blood pressure, and all of these were a lot of work done by Alan Lucas. Low density lipoprotein levels in historical infants fed breast milk versus formula, and less insulin and leptin resistance when they reach adolescence. I think there will be a lot more room for this in the future and some exciting new advances that are coming up. The dose response relationship. Whenever we're looking to see if something is actually caused by something and not something else, we look to see whether there's a response with a dose. And so in epidemiological studies, we've seen the relationship, the associations. So we do find there is a dose response relationship. Every 10 milliliter increase of human milk in the diet will lead to a 5% reduction rate in hospital readmissions, neurodevelopmental outcomes, which are more crucial to all of us. Every 10 ml per day, per kilo per day, advance in breast milk will raise your IQ points by 0.53 on the MDI, which is our equivalent in babies for IQ. So 110 mLs, if you were giving that, would raise it by 5.3 points. And usually we're hoping to give somewhere close to 160, 180 per kilo, and just think what that could do for our child. Donor milk. So what does donor milk mean? There is going to be, in the American system, we have this ability. We have banks, and luckily we've had a bank near our hospital for the last 50 years. And so while most of the country is converting to donor milk, we have used donor milk for ever since our unit was young. Human breast milk that's pooled and pasteurized, it's created from healthy lactating mothers, but this milk is pasteurized. It goes through Holder pasteurization at a temp of 62.5 degrees for about 30 minutes. And the mother, but this is also involved with a process. So the mother pumps into a container, she moves it to a mailing container, which is cooled and frozen, and then it's thawed and pooled into another container. There it's pasteurized. Up to 25 mothers' milk is put into a single container. It's pasteurized, so it's exposed to heat, then it's put into distribution containers, and then it's frozen. It's thawed in the NICU, and then mixed with another container with fortifier and put into a bottle for the baby. So at least a minimum of 7 changes. And every time you go through a change, you know that breast milk, the fat is not completely emulsified into the milk. It is separate inside of fat milk globules. And those stick to the surface of plastic. If it's in glass.
So,
Is this better?
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So at least 7 changes. And so 7 opportunities to reduce fat. And we're going to see that in some of our other slides that come up front. So of course, people who are used to using formula have been fighting this to some extent. Formula milk versus donor milk on growth and development. So Cochrane meta-analysis in 2018 was done. Formula, they found in the short term, had faster rates of weight gain, higher OFCs, and linear growth. And there's a huge debate among us neonatologists about how we believe how fast should a child grow. But most of us believe it should be sort of parallel to intrauterine growth rates. Significant increase in neck was seen, however, and that risk ratio was 1.87, which really means that you have an 87% increased risk of neck. And if you look at the range, it's 1.23 to 2.85, which is 23% to 175% increase in necrotizing enterocolitis compared to the children that were on donor human milk. So, and they found no long-term effects on growth or improved neurodevelopment between the 2 groups. So long-term, it may be not very different. In the short-term, better rate for formula in this study, but definitely this increase support for preventing necrotizing enterocolitis. So in 2020, another RCT came out, and they looked again at all the different studies that are involved. And there was a large number of randomized control trials and observational studies that came out between 2015 and 2019. And these are sort of summarized in this article. So it's very recent work. And they found 4 RCTs. They found no real difference in the RCTs in terms of difference of length of stay or necrotizing enterocolitis. When they looked at just the observational studies, and observational studies don't necessarily have to be biased, but they looked at 2,496 children, and they showed a reduction of 11.7 days, so almost 12 days in the donor milk group in length of stay. So really, I think we're talking about a reduction in morbidities that could lead to that sort of a difference, because most of our infants will developmentally go home somewhere between 37 to 39 weeks. So it had to have been children that had significant morbidities that were cut down on to create such a big difference in the length of stay in the NICU. They also found a protective effect of necrotizing enterocolitis, which was a 52% reduction in the favor, so a protective effect of necrotizing enterocolitis. And I think you can see at the bottom of the screen, these are the studies that they summarized. You can see how recent they all are, and that we're looking here at a protective effect of donor milk against necrotizing enterocolitis. When you look down a little further into the studies that they did, there are actually some of their groups that got mother's milk on both sides. And so like this one, mother's milk plus fortifier and donor milk plus fortifier, and mother's milk plus preterm fortifier. And when you look for things like that, when you see things like that, you realize that this actually wasn't a homogeneous group. So I looked a little more closely at the ones that were simply a group of donor milk versus a group of preterm milk. That's really hard to see. But if we look at this section over here, you can see the difference in the length of stay was actually 60 days for the donor milk group versus 94 days for the formula group. And if we look at these guys that also had a group of donor milk and a group of preterm formula alone without using mother's milk in the picture, it was 60 days versus 75 versus 75 days. So we're looking at somewhere between 15 and maybe much longer improvement in length of stay when you look directly head to head with donor milk versus formula. So now let's look at the effect of pasteurization. So what is donor milk, right? If we're going to be using this for a large number of our children, and if we're pasteurizing it in pressure cookers, what are we doing to it, right? So the studies that I'm going to be presenting to you are really talking about milk that's been exposed to Holder pasteurization and milk that has been pooled into these milk banks. So this was looked at by Pimentis, and they showed us that there was lower lactose. There was variable fat in different studies. Again, it depends on where you were in your stage of pumping. Was it fore milk versus hind milk? And again, there was definitely more handling in containers, and we found that lipids were considerably less in volume in the donor milk versus the mother's milk. And then proteins, of course, you see a somewhat reduction in protein, which already breast milk is a little bit lower on protein for preterm infants. So this is a huge loss. When we look at breast milk, we know that it's not just macronutrients. Now we have to drill down into the benefits that are immunologic and anti-inflammatory. So normally in breast milk, we see bifidobacillus, we see immunoglobulins, we see lactoferrin. This fascinating object is actually 10 to 20% of the protein content of human milk. And what it does is that it traps iron. And when it traps iron, it creates an in vitro environment that is anti-E. coli and salmonella, which are huge gut issues. In mice, it reduces Staph aureus. And for this reason, it has been used a lot in prevention of VAP. So it is ventilator-associated pneumonias. Here, we actually use the mother's colostrum to bathe the infant's mouth and to reduce the colonization with Staph aureus and other gram-positives. And in vitro, it reduces RSV, rotavirus, and norovirus, all of which we could do without. Of course, regular breast milk, if we were feeding from the breast, we would get macrophages, T cells, lymphocytes, stem cells. But these all disappear during pumping and bottle feeding. So the majority of these things do not pass to our preterm infants. Let's start drilling down into the nitty-gritty of these. So what actually happens once we do this processing to these this milk? This was a great study where they looked at mother's milk, and they looked at mother's milk immunoglobulins, both in the milk as well as in the stomach once it had been given there. Then they looked at donor breast milk, and they looked at donor breast milk in the stomach. So DBM is donor breast milk, and DBM gastric is gastric. And I don't think it needs a whole lot of imagination to see that all the donor milk numbers are considerably lower. Considerably lower than regular mom's milk that hasn't been pasteurized. As a reduction in IgA of 55%, 71% for secretory IgA. Now, this is another fascinating subject. Secretory IgA reduces microorganism attachment to the gut mucosa, and it increases viral excretion and neutralizes microbial toxins. And so I think very, very important for our preterm infants. Unfortunately, we've lost completely all IgM. So if this mother had an active infection, she is no longer going to be able to protect her infant. And IgG of about 41% reduction is there. So what are the effects of pasteurization further on other immunomodulatory things? So, you know, those were affected considerably. When we look at the reduction of immune cell and function, we've already said they're gone and they won't exist. Lactoferrin along with lysozyme. Now these actually work as a team. So lactoferrin binds the iron and the lysozyme breaks down the cell wall. They're very anti-gram positive. And that activity is completely lost in donor milk. So we're looking at, I shouldn't say completely lost, that's a bad word, they're reduced. So the activity is reduced by 95% and 85% respectively, which in my mind is considerably. And lactoferrin binds erythropoietin, which is a really important growth factor for us, is reduced. And cytokines and other majority of growth factors remain the same. So that is really exciting. The other really exciting part of it is that things like oligosaccharides that we consider essential, and we're learning more and more about them every single day, are left untouched. Gangliosides, which are glycosphingolipids that function as target receptors for bacterial adhesion, they function at, so sorry, that's a typo there. They reduce bowel necrosis and inflammatory reactions. And milk fat are pretty much left intact. We did find when we did our analysis at Valley of Breast Milk that some of our long chain fatty acids were broken. We had a higher concentration of MCT oil for some reason in the donor milk. And we think it may have something to do with some heat breakdown that we're not able to compensate for. So drilling down a little bit more into human milk, oligosaccharides, these are non-nutritive for humans. There are 3 to 32 sugars in size. There are many different in number. They're the third most common content of human milk. And for a long time, they're even higher than protein. So for a long time, they were actually considered a reason why human milk was not important for children, because it has sugars that they can't digest, because they would reach the distal small intestine and colon in an intact form and were excreted without digestion. It turns out they have a significant function, and they are food for specific bacteria that's designed by the mother. That is they also have, so they help in development of the microbiome of the infant. They also have antibacterial properties, bacteriostatic for group B strep, which we know is a monster and eats our babies, and reduces candidal attachment. We struggle with candida in many of our infants now, especially in those that receive antibiotics. And anti-adhesive properties. So HMOs resemble the adhesive glycans. So if they can keep the bacteria from attaching to the wall of the intestine, they can stop invasive infections, and or they can keep the concentration down to the extent that we do not get an invasive infection. So C. jejuni, enteropathogenic E. coli in mice, and Entamoeba histolytica have all been seen. Adhesion blockage has been seen by oligosaccharides. Now, we were talking about the microflora. The diet of the infant really does change the microflora considerably. If you look at the microflora in the intestine or the microbiome in the intestine of the breastfed versus the formula-fed infant, there really is no comparison. The beneficial bacteria like bifidobacteria and lactobacillus outnumber Enterobacteriaceae by 1,000x. And again, most of this establishment has happened very early on. Formula-fed infants often have iron in their feeds, and dysbiosis develops mostly with E. coli. And every time we reach for a formula bottle, I want you to remember what's at stake. It's a full microbiome. we have realized over the years, and I know I shared this slide with you last year, is that the intestine in our infants is something like that of this germ-free mouse. It is a undeveloped intestine for our babies, and it needs to interact with bacteria. And so the correct food for the bacteria is crucial for a good outcome. Also, having a variety of bacteria rather than a single bacteria seems very important for the normal development of our intestine. This is an intestine that has been exposed to food for bacteria, as well as the correct bacteria. A defined flora was placed. Can I ask someone to mute, please? And then we have this area at the bottom, which is a Peyer's patch. And a Peyer's patch is the length of the intestine that fights infection. I think it doesn't take much imagination to imagine that if you had this, or if you had a neonatal, you had a preterm infant with this sort of an intestinal wall versus this sort of an intestinal wall, that a bacterial infection here could much more easily get through and cause necrotizing enterocolitis than an infection on the surface of this other of the defined flora section. So mother's milk, can be regarded as personalized nutrition because the mother actually changes her oligosaccharides based on what bacteria she has passed to her infant, as well as possibly her diet and how she wants her child to grow. So we can consider a prebiotic with oligosaccharides plus probiotic because it contains some of the bifidobacillus that we want this baby to get, and it becomes a symbiotic. However, once you pasteurize it, we're really stuck with only the prebiotic phase or the oligosaccharide. And honestly, I'll take that over formula any day, but I would so much rather have unpasteurized human breast milk. So this was another area that I just started looking into recently and got totally fascinated by. Some of this is conjecture, and I want you to know it as exactly that. I came across this article talking about a new technology of something called exosomes, by which a cell, they create a stem cell, and the stem cell creates these little evaginations. They have a cover of the wall on the outside, and they carry mRNA, and they're able to inoculate someone by the oral route. And I thought, this is interesting. And they're focusing on preventions of preventing diabetes type 2, which has been linked to metabolic syndrome. So when I thought about that, I was like, I wonder about breast milk. And I found this article in 2020 that showed that human milk actually has exosomes in it. They were looking, and not just only human milk that's unpasteurized, but even pasteurized human milk has exosomes in it. In other words, this mother is, or somebody else's mother, is sending these exosomes that carry mRNA that can be absorbed into the infant gut and help that infant's either immune system or metabolism, because in the other case, it has been used to modify metabolism. When they looked at both these raw and pasteurized human breast milk exosomes, they used them in the face of hypoxia, as well as injured organoids, and they found that there was still function with decreased inflammation. For in vivo, they looked at NEC-induced mucosal injury was cut down, inflammation and mucus production were all improved by both raw and pasteurized human breast milk derived exosomes. I think we're going to hear more about these exosomes. And I was looking so hard to find stuff about how do we control for metabolic syndrome. We know we do it. We know breast milk helps. We know that infants that get breast milk have less type 1 diabetes. We wondered if it was just through the modifications of the microbiome, but I wonder if it's more than that. And I think exosomes are going to have a part to play. So pasteurization, of course, the type of pasteurization matters. And you guys know this better than any one of us. I had to learn this. Holder pasteurization flash pasteurization. So holder was, you raise it to 63 degrees centigrade and you hold it for 30 minutes. Flash was a high temperature for a short time, and then very high temperature. And then UVC is using UV light to pasteurize. And there's this new alternative, which may again be standard to you, it was news to me, that uses high pressure processing. It uses cold water and hydrostatic pressure, and it is a viable alternative as the milk is left in a better condition. So micronutrients across the board is retained after pasteurization. However, we're losing crucial things like folate, essential in the development of the brain, vitamin C, essential is lost across the board with pasteurization. Bile salt stimulating lipase, important for digestion in the preterm infant, and less necrotizing enterocolitis when it's present, how any sort of heat will destroy it in seconds. Even UV light destroys it. And lysozyme, which we had talked about earlier, breaking down gram-positive walls, is also retained with high pressure processing. And I wonder somehow if we're going to be able to move this into our practice to help our infants in the long run. So another thing that we battle with in the NICU is reactive oxygen species. Our infants are exposed to oxygen. Just let's, a few numbers. We have superoxide dismutase processes that lead to hydrogen peroxide from oxygen. And there are deficiencies of this in the newborn infant and significant deficiencies in the preterm infant. And then you have this, formus of hypochlorous acid, singlet oxygen, hydroxy radicals, hydrogen peroxide, all these terrible reactive oxygen species that start to come about, even with normal oxygen, honestly, to some extent, but to a far greater degree for our preterm infants. So our babies undergo something called oxidative stress, and that's exposure to more oxygen. So we need to give them oxygen sometimes because their lungs are immature. However, just for the baseline baby, just being born premature, in utero, you would have been in about a 17% oxygen environment. So when you come out, you are at 21%. And so oxygen, so just even 21% oxygen that we breathe or what we consider room air can cause issues. So early exposure to oxidative stress can lead to lifelong injury. Diseases that we found associated with oxidative stress have been chronic lung disease, retinopathy of prematurity, necrotizing enterocolitis, and periventricular leukomalacia. Some of these far more, and some of these are monsters. Antioxidants are low in infants at birth, and the ability to increase antioxidant production is impaired. When we look at immature cells, they seem to be more sensitive. And one of the cells that people have identified the most as being sensitive to stress are oligodendrocytes. And honestly, when we look at development of the brain, we should have had a picture here, but we have almost all the neurons we need by the time we're 24 weeks gestation. So what we're actually doing in this last trimester, or what's happening in the brain during this time, is this production of a large number of immature oligodendrocytes that will then support these neurons to produce connections. They start to produce axons and dendrites when the oligodendrocytes mature closer to 34 weeks. And so for children between that period of time, 24 and 34 weeks, which is the majority of our smaller infants, these immature oligodendrocytes are totally sensitive to things that like oxidative stress, and very important for us to have antioxidants for these children. And so far, the best way of getting it across to them seems to be actually breast milk to some extent, and how we feed them. So some body mechanisms, I found this one as a picture on the internet. I'm not, these just basically showing different cycles. I'm not sure if this is the, so alpha tocopherols are essential in this. Selenium we've known about in other areas, as well as glutathiones, all help in stabilizing reactive oxygen species. So we want to make sure that we're actually able to provide this to our infants. when we look at an antioxidant comparison in breast milk, donor milk, and infant formula. So in an infant formula, they get to pour in what they want, right? So breast milk, we get what the mother gives us, and donor milk, we get what we've got after we processed it or pressure cooked it or whatever you want to say. We look at milk from 12 mothers, and what they found was the things that were added into the breast milk, into the formula were in larger amounts in formula, and the things that were not were in larger amounts in breast milk. And so breast milk had a wider diversity of nutritional antioxidants than formula did. And they had smaller amounts of some things like alpha tocopherol that were added in. But donor milk was significantly reduced, but not zero. And I want you to remember that it's not zero, it's about half. And in some cases, a little bit, maybe if we look at 21% of the cryptoxanthins, 21 in the breast milk down to 3.8 in the donor milk, that's a considerable drop. So while it's present, it's considerably reduced. All these formulas here are Abbott formulas that they used in this particular study. They went on to look to measure the actual amounts of the alpha tocopherols and G tocopherol. And you can just see, I don't think it takes a lot to say that the donor milk had less, and also significantly less of the alpha carotene, the beta carotene, lycopenes in particular, that help with eye development, and lutein and zeaxanthin possibly less affected, but still all affected when exposed to heat. So all of these were exposed to Holder pasteurization. So let's move on to something different. Now that so how does breast milk help with neurodevelopmental outcomes? Did they help their oligodendrocyte or not? Several studies show a positive impact of breast milk use on premature infants in neurodevelopmental outcomes. We see better psychomotor development at 2 and 5 years of age. And not just that, but they did show lower weight gain. And this has been what has really held back a lot of people from choosing to go with breast milk in our infants. Dose response relationship is seen. The more breast milk you do, the better brain growth you see in certain areas. Predominant breast milk feeding in the first 28 days was associated with greater deep nuclear gray matter volumes at term equivalent age and better working memory and motor function at 7 years of age. And I think many of these studies have focused on breast milk without fortification. And I am actually a very strong proponent for fortification. I see several studies where they have used fortification. When they do, and if the intakes of the infants are the same for protein and the same for fat between the formula fed and the breastfed infants, I think we see the same growth. And we in our unit continue to use breast milk, and we continue to try to fortify it in different ways to give us the extra protein we need, and other things like that. So we'll be talking about that a little later. Is someone, oh, I see this chat. Okay, I will get out of the chat. So occipitofrontal circumference. Now, I think we are used to monitoring our infants with a paper tape or a cloth tape. Of course, we recommend the cloth, with measuring the outside of the skull of our infants. And we've always assumed that this represents the brain volume inside, because we're used to this full-term baby picture, which shows the brain abutting the skull. And surely, if we measure it, we are getting a measurement of the brain volume itself. In premature infants, we can see this, and it's not just a can. In many of our small infants, we do MRIs on discharge. You end up seeing this white area around the outside, which represents fluid, and this black area represents the brain tissue. What you can see in this particular infant's case is you can see the sulci and gyri are less deep. You can see your white matter looks less healthy, it's paler, it has more water in it. And you have this larger amount of extraaxial fluid that surrounds this brain. And you can see that this head circumference is not really reflecting the size of this infant's brain. You could actually measure from here to here to here to here. We have done some studies looking at MRIs, measurements, not the full volumetric stuff. We don't have that option, but simply looking at measuring it from, by the biparietal measurement of the brain can give you a better idea of the volume than you can simply by occipitofrontal circumference. But again, what do you have in the field and what do we follow on a regular basis on most of our children? It's really the OFC and, hope. Okay, go away. All right, here we go. So this is a schematic I totally stole that I totally love, and I wanted to share with you. This brings into focus the nutritional elements that we need for different parts of brain development. So zinc, thiamine, copper, and iron, it's probably going to be hard to read. I'll say it out loud to some extent, are the ones that are focusing on our enzyme systems. Really, really crucial for our enzyme systems in the brain and the neurotransmitters. When we look at fat, long chain fatty acids in a general piece, we're looking at myelin synthesis, the connections between the cells and neurogenesis and healing with the long chain fatty acids. Very, very important. So yes. And then on the other side of this, we can look at this area here, where we're looking at what do calories and energy do for you. And you're looking at basic growth, basic volume, total brain volume, some neurotransmitters, but to a very large extent, regulation, lean body mass accretion has been linked to neuronal growth, differentiation, dendritic arborization, synaptogenesis, and myelin synthesis, leading to more efficient neural processing. So a lot of focus of my life has been, how do we get more lean mass accretion, especially in the breastfed infant? So improved neurodevelopmental outcomes have also been seen with this milk fat globule membrane that's you probably have all learned more about than I have. Apparently the milk fat in humans is not emulsified into the milk, but encased in this membrane, and this membrane consists of a lot of phospholipids and sphingomyelin. And those seem to help a lot in the cognitive domain. I hesitate to believe that is the pure reason that infants are smarter. However, there is a study out there that believes that once you added the MFGM to the formula, the infants functioned as well as the breast milk infants. And I think that is good that we can now offer this to our formula fed infants. But I am not sure that this study is the only answer as to why our infants are doing better when they're breastfed. So changes in maternal diet that can affect breast milk. So now here we hopefully have talked to the mother and told her, oh my God, if you don't breastfeed your baby or provide breast milk for your infant, your baby could have necrotizing enterocolitis, the number of infections in the NICU could eat your baby up, etc. But we need to take care of her if we are to provide the appropriate breast milk. So the majority of breast milk remains about the same, no matter what nutrition you are on, but there are some parts of it that vary considerably between mother and mother. And some of that is the water soluble vitamin levels. There's this hugely different, and it totally depends on what maternal levels are. The maternal type of fat intake. So while we don't have less fat in some of our, mothers that are undernourished, at least here in America, the pattern of their fat intake is reflected in the fat composition of the breast milk. In fact, there was this great study from Canada in 2000, I think, when we were all beginning to talk about trans fat, and they found that 10% of the fat in the breast milk there was trans fat. So if a mother is eating trans fat, it will be in her breast milk. If she's eating long chain fatty acids, they're going to be in her breast milk. And that is one of the advantages that breast milk has over over cow's milk, shall we say. So I believe strongly in feeding the mother. We provide our mothers with nutritional vouchers and provide her with vitamins, micronutrients, and I believe in providing omega-3 fatty acids, so like DHA and ARA, so that she can have adequate amounts to provide for her infant's growth. These would have been given to the child anyway in their trimester. Weeks, and we hope to send them home before this 40-week mark. But you can see how much more cell and gyri formation has to happen during this period of time. And the 36-weekers that almost never come to the NICU, look at the difference in just the brain stem size and the complexity of the cerebellum. So we'll often find that our preterm infants are not able to effectively breastfeed, even at 36 weeks. And so we need to be very, very careful with our triple feeding plans and our monitoring of the intake of any preterm infant that is under 36 weeks and definitely even under 37 weeks. I've seen some 37-weekers not do that great at the breast. And if you're an OB and you're listening, know that if you're going to deliver a child at 34 weeks, they are not going to be good breastfeeders. And looking at what makes a difference to these children, they will become better breastfeeders when they get to 40 weeks, but we have 6 weeks in between to get them there. And you would be interfering with brain development at about this time. So let's move forward. Many of our children, and now this is a very simple tool that we've all seen many times before, but I just want to stress something here. We categorize our children based on weight. We categorize them based on whether they're small for their gestational age. So you've all probably seen a growth chart. Let me just intro this for those who haven't. This is their, oops. So you can see that I stole this from Wikipedia. Back. Okay. Where are we? All right, perfect. So a simple growth chart where we follow their gestational age and we decide whether they're small for gestational age, they're appropriate for gestational age between the 10th and the 90th, or they're large for gestational age. And notice that we're really focusing on weight. My take on it is that we should really be focusing on lean body mass alone. When you look at this study, this was one of the more fascinating ones that I've seen. They looked at kidney growth of our children. Were you preterm and intrauterine growth restricted? Were you just plain old intrauterine growth restricted? And this is the legacy that was left from this difficult pregnancy on these children. They measured the kidney size at 40 weeks on all these children. And you can see that many of them had a very similar birth weight. The preterm IUGR, as well as the IUGR infants, were all somewhere in that, low 2000 range. And when you look at the renal volumes, you look to see the preterm infant with the intrauterine growth restriction was the worst. And that continued with both total renal volume as well as cortical volume. And we have to look back and remember that we produce nephrons until 34 weeks. And after that, each individual nephron grows individually. So if we do not provide enough nutrition, that infant is going to come out with less nephrons if we use medications that injure the nephrons, like things to close the patent ductus, something called indocin, ibuprofen, hopefully not as much, gentamicin, antibiotics. These are things that are going to leave a lasting impact on these children is, I think, no surprise to any of us looking at this, that these smaller kidneys may go on to give us hypertension in the future and early renal failure. In fact, if we look at just the PAS, I think, was it 2 years ago, where there was this complete influx of nephrologists telling us, you know what, your premature infants are now heading on 40 years, and many of them are needing assistance with renal support. And so, again, we are going to try and increase our lean body mass or our linear growth. And when I think we have to go into the growth mindset, we have to remember the composition of intracellular fluid. The intracellular fluid, you're going to need a lot of potassium, a lot of phosphate, a lot of magnesium, a lot of protein, and you need to provide all of these if you want to get growth. So if you see an SGA baby or a small for gestational age baby, these are the things they mop up, and these are the things that drop in the bloodstream when we start to feed them. So you have to give them all evenly to not get refeeding syndrome. So effect of very low birth weight infants and subnormal head size on cognitive abilities. I see that I'm running a little short on time. May I continue for another 15 minutes or so? So the effect of very low birth weight and subnormal head volume on cognitive abilities. This shows us that our infants undergo extrauterine growth restriction. So if you are 30 weeks, about, how many, 12% of our infants are already growth restricted. By the time we get to 40 weeks, we've done a bad job with neonatal nutrition, and we have a large number of infants that now have growth restriction. And then here, this is actually the head circumference of under 2 standard deviations below the mean, so under the third. We're looking at 8 months of age, the study looked at, and found we had recovered along the line. So what we found was that at 8 years of age, when they looked back at these children, the people that had recovered their head circumference by 8 months had much better IQs than those that had not recovered their head circumference by that period in time. And that reflected across all domains of IQ, achievement, math, and spelling. And the course of postnatal growth in our small infants has predicted neurological outcome for us for a while. And we find that infants that are appropriate for gestational age at birth, then they become growth restricted, and then they stay small for gestational age. Those children will have reduced amounts of reduced scores on their mental developmental and physical developmental index, whether if they recover, if they're small for gestational age at birth and they're able to recover by, I know I've written 9 months of age, but I'm pretty sure that you have to cross the 10th percentile by term. If you can recover by term, we can get you to a normal physical and developmental index, the same as if you were appropriate for gestational age. The children that are the worst off are the children that are SGA. I think I was a little off in the schematic, so this is more for description. Don't really follow it for numbers. So a small for gestational age, stayed small, the worst outcomes. So we have to track it to know that we're having issues, things recover. We currently use the Fenton 13 that transitions the WHO growth chart. And a quick reminder that we have something called a bell-shaped curve, which we're used to talking about percentiles. And what now translate malnutrition has been with how many Z-scores are you away? And I want to remind everyone, because it's confusing, that if you're a sigma, so 1 sigma away from the mean, or you're 1 Z-score away from the mean, it means exactly the same thing. So you are 1 standard deviation away from the mean when you're a sigma away or a Z-score away. So We're all used to seeing growth charts that look like this. And for many of us, this would not be a red flag. And unfortunately, because of the curve in this, apparently we are not able to identify growth failure right off the bat. So we have converted to using these charts to help us understand things a little better. These are called Z-score growth charts. And what we do with them is that they're linear. We put the absolute number down. And in this, my dietitians have been following both the absolute change as well as the relative change week to week. When you translate this curve into this, you can see that this infant has fallen drastically. It's evident to your eyes, whereas it's not as evident as you see the infant tracking along his curve here, where you think, he's tracking along, but yet here you're seeing this nosedive, and it's time for us to make an intervention. So outcomes, everyone has become obsessed with growth. The new way that we look at growth is our growth velocity. And this is growth velocity measured in different ways in different studies. So that's something to just be aware of. Some people start measuring their growth velocity from when the children achieve birth weight. If you measure your growth velocity from birth, it's usually close to 17%. If you compare this first quartile with the fourth quartile, this was done on 600 babies in terms of weight gain per grams per kilo per day from 12 to 21. You basically reduced the amount of, you made a huge difference in the neuro exam, and your developmental impairment went down by a third. And this has been what kept most people from going to donor milk. Because as I said, fortification is the key. So growth monitoring and indicators, we're used to head circumference measurements. Linear growth is crucial. We use 0.8 to 1 centimeter a week in a head circumference and length. And again, we measure our linear growth with a board, a length board. I highly recommend this because so often stiff baby legs can be an issue. Protein, inflammation, calcium, phosphorus, and zinc. And then measures of growth. When we look at weight, we should no longer just be looking at weight alone. We should be trying to divide it into fat mass and lean body mass and focus on lean body mass production in our infants so that we're getting muscles, bones, and organs, length and head circumference. In this regard, we use a lot of physical therapy. Preterm infants have historically been shown to have disproportionate growth. They have too little lean body mass and too much abdominal fat. And we know in adults that abdominal fat is what's linked to metabolic syndromes and diseases. People have tried to address this with the BMI charts. Olson in 2015 came out with them, their weight divided by height squared. And it is a fairly reliable indicator. But when we compared this to our study on body composition analysis with air displacement plethysmography, it really only represented 51% of the appropriate fatness that we were able to identify. This is what we're using now. I won't go into it, it's expensive. Factors negatively influencing growth in the preterm infant. So nutritional factors, like inadequate provision of calories, protein, hyponatremia, and micronutrient deficits, this should be a given for us. We should be doing this for everyone. We have started to focus on this. And then we look at the non-nutritional factors, physiologic stress, inflammation, endocrine factors, infection, medication, hypoxia, pain and emotional deprivation, possibly modified microbiota. And we look at the ones in green and we realize this is fixed by breastfeeding and by breast milk and by the presence of the mother. And I think that that's really crucial, that breast milk is not just a food, it also provides the non-nutritional influences that we need. A crucial factor to get our infants to grow is to actually increase their parasympathetic tone. Mom and dad? Mom, anyway, sorry. Skin to skin, music therapy, and massage therapy have all been found to increase weight and benefit the infants. So pro-growth. In the old, we wanted to make sure that you have enough calories, protein, and micronutrients, and that's a given. That's your bottom line. We started our Ignite team to follow regularly 2 times a week. We've taught our parents massage, and several studies have shown about a 20% increase in weight gain. I highly recommend this to all. We wanted to reduce inflammation. We're working on ways to cut down on our infections and reduce antibiotic exposure. Now, I think this is really crucial. When you give antibiotics, you're not just killing the bad bacteria, you're also killing the good bacteria. And when they die, they create inflammation. And so just by virtue of giving antibiotics, you are creating inflammation. So we're working on ways of not giving antibiotics to deal with infection or prevention of infection, and reducing prophylactic antibiotics. So breast milk feeding is of course better bacteria, improved microbiome, and an increase in parasympathetic tone. We try to decrease pain. We have reduced our number of sticks for the babies for glucose checks. We reduce our blood draws to every 2 weeks. We reduce anxiety and stress. We try to do skin to skin as much as we can whenever our parents are present. We encourage frequent family visits, and we have music therapy. We tape music for the children to hear sung by their parents, as well as we have someone to sing to them. And I pretty much have come to the conclusion that we all have begun singing to our infants. You're going to walk in and find our nurses singing to the babies. I personally have started singing during every intervention I've been doing. So I hope to bring that joy to others. Principles of nutrition intervention starting at birth. I'm going to zip through this because you probably already know this. We focus on delayed cord clamping. Sorry, it looks like that got cut back here. We have increased blood volume of 20 cc's per kilo, which leaves us with increased iron stores. We can add epogen, which is a growth factor and early into these infants' lives. We have less physiologic stress, so they're more likely to stay in a positive nitrogen balance and stay anabolic. We want our infants to stay anabolic and not go catabolic. Do blood draws from the placenta to cut back on taking things out of the blood that are more than just our sample, and get colostrum in that first hour after birth and teach our mother to hand express at that very time. Of course, it's better if we could get to it prenatally, but here we are. Always try to keep your infant in a positive nitrogen balance. And that's just the bottom line. You always need to give your infant more than 1.2 grams per kilo per day. The number varies depending on where you look at it, but I think that's a good basic minimum to start with. We need to keep our children growing even though they're sick. There was a firm belief that when they were sick, that they would not grow. They're growing in the background even when they're horribly sick, and we need to try and keep them that way. 1 day of a negative nitrogen balance, you lose 4 days of growth at least. Try never to get there. Vanilla TPN, we start at ASAP. We call it vanilla because it's clear. It basically has 2% amino acid, 10% dextrose, and some calcium in it to help our infants through. We start it within the first hour. We decide, how do we decide the need for calories? And I put this in here more to remind people that if our infant is breathing hard, they may need more calories. And if our infant and what they're going to use for growth is really just the last 25 to 30 calories, because everything else is used in just maintenance. So if we can't get that 25 to 30 calories, which comes from that little tweak of a little bit extra food every day. So every day when we go to that bedside, we need to adjust their feeds. Are they on the correct amount of calories? Tweak up because they grow, and how lucky we are that they grow to be able to give us that little edge for growth. What protein and calorie and energy needs we need, they're going to be different if you're parenteral versus enteral nutrition. It's going to depend based on what gestational age you are. And so I've put the numbers down here. Fortification of breast milk is essential. As you've seen from those previous numbers, 4 grams of enteral protein is never going to be given to you by either donor milk or banked breast or mother's milk, even in that regard. For mother's milk, if we were going with the 1.5 grams of protein per deciliter that we see, you would need 250 mLs, which we can't give our infants. You might be able to give it to them if they don't have lung disease, So definitely when they're older, but when they're younger, you're going to need to fortify breast milk. Currently, we're using high protein hydrolyzed liquid
Excuse me,
fortifiers.
ma'am, just how much more time would you be taking? Because
I think I can just be done.
it's
So,
very interesting, but I think if people will lose their concentration span.
okay, so I think you probably all know this. I've included this in the slides. We have to feed at different rates for preterm infants depending on the gestational age. Please have feeding guidelines in place. Vitamin A is crucial. We've started to use this because it's destroyed in both breast milk as well as in heating as well as in our TPN. So ideas for increasing or maintaining breast milk. So just, is this something that you guys have already talked about in the day? Then I won't waste my time, your time, apologies. So we involve the mother, we tell her the benefits, we discuss the need with the mother prenatally if possible. We get consent for donor milk and hand expression if she's under anesthesia. We take it from her, colostrum extraction and administration in the first hour. We discuss massage and teach hand expression and encourage pumping. We request milk every 3 hours. Tips for pumping, I have included here. There are different phrases that we use with breast milk extraction. In the first 3 days, hand expression, when you're using your hand to take out the colostrum, is crucial. Pumping, they need an electric breast pump. Hands-on pumping is pumping when you put your hands on your breast and pump at the same time. So it's sort of a breast massage while pumping, and frequent pumping works well in the first few weeks. This was a presentation in 2016 that I saw from Jane Morton. The first graph up here is by somebody called Hill, and they looked at pumping alone and pumping with massage and hand massage showed that you could get a higher breast milk volume and let the mother feel more confident and have more milk for the baby if she used pumping with hand massage. And then Dr. Morton added in that if you did hand expression in the first 3 days plus pumping and then did pumping with your hands, that you could get the red line or even better milk extraction. So in summary, breast milk is the best feeding. Poor growth can be overcome with fortifiers. Mothers should be educated, supported, nourished, monitored, and encouraged, even in the NICU. Kangaroo care and baby to breast, skin to skin should be encouraged. And thank you for listening, even though you must be exhausted and tired at the end of your day.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I think it was a very, very exhaustive talk, and this talk actually can be split into number of days to really understand and digest all the information that you had put. So
I'm so sorry it was so dense. I should have made it more fun.
No, I mean, no, it was really highly technical and very informative, and additional evidence that has been emerging as to why breast milk is best is what you showed, and that was really great. And again, the lesson learned is, yes, breast milk is the best. Expressed breast milk is the next best. The banks, although they are not, this is a better alternative than formula milk, but not again as best as the breast milk. That's what I think we learned from this entire highly technical presentation. And of course, mother's nutrition, very, very important for improving the quality of breast milk. Because all these years we were thinking that, although macronutrients may not make much difference if the nutritional status of the mother is not that great, but then if these are the other very important nutrients which do get affected. So I think we have to again give a lot of importance to healthy diet for the mother. And one question I have, how to save or how to prevent prematurity or preterm? Any nutrition playing a role in that? Low birth weight, yes, yeah.
That's a very deep question. And that's so deep that it's deeper than my understanding to a very large extent. I do think, though, here we see obesity And I think that there is sometimes when there's obesity,
Yeah,
there's
that
a
will be
lack of, there's an overgrowth of bacteria sometimes, and that can lead to some preterm labor. Really, honestly, we are struggling with prematurity, understanding the causes of it, but some of it seems quite evident that it was predestined in some cases, that there was bacteria between the lining of the layers of the, the placenta, the membranes that cover, that if bacteria get trapped in that section, that can set up inflammatory markers and lead to prematurity. Of course, there is the mother that had, less OB care or whatever, and ends up with an incompetent cervix. And we really, that's one of those things that we can't do that much about. But nutritionally, I think mothers have a huge role nowadays. If they can stay in a normal size during their pregnancy and avoid obesity before their pregnancies, I think it's going to modify the oligosaccharides, and it's going to modify probably prematurity to some extent, though I don't have a study to quote to be able to say that.
That's a research question then. We can look at that.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, another very, although you did mention that, the more the preterm a child is, the better that child needs breast milk, but then difficult to give him breast milk. So how do you manage that situation? Because
So
the child is not able to
I'm
suckle.
really sorry. Those were some of the things I skipped over. We do something called prophic feeding, and we give drops of breast milk over 5 days for the smallest kids and over 2 days for the other children. And it leads to the correct microbiome and then closing up of the gap junctions of the intestine. And then we can slowly increase the amount of milk we're giving and cut back on the TPN or the total parenteral exposure to IV nutrition that we're giving these children. We're able to transition our children off pretty quickly if they're over 1,000 grams. They're usually off within 3 to 4 days. They're on full feeds, but our other infants, if you're looking at a 24-weeker, it can take up to 12 days to get to full feeds in that case. So again, you have the intestine can be induced using breast milk. With the oligosaccharides, we develop the correct microbiome, we tighten up those gap junctions, less likely to have necrotizing enterocolitis. And then we can slowly but surely progress up on our feedings. You can't do it with formula.
I have to, after listening to you, I have, my conviction is more and more stronger that we need to have a super specialization course in pediatric nutrition. And I think we will seek your help in designing that. And I think it is important that we do give that super specialty course after masters to our dietitians to understand all these nuances of preterm feeding and NICU and looking after children. I think it's very important, and we would seek your help for that, ma'am.
I'd be totally honored. But I will tell you that our dietitians have to spend, because unless the physicians themselves understand the need for changing the feeds or adjusting the feeds or adding a supplement, they're not, it doesn't matter what you write in the chart. It won't happen.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. And over to the other participants if they have any important questions. Sorry
About the delay. I really apologize. It's been a lot shorter. My apologies.
It is so interesting that I really couldn't stop myself from asking these very important questions, which I thought were necessary for us to understand. Over to others. Vanisha, you can, if anybody has, or
yes, ma'am. Thank you,
if
ma'am.
there is any question that you have. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Shruti will moderate.
Yes,
yeah, Shruti, please.
For summing up the session as well as starting the Q&A session. Ma'am, there are few questions that I would like to ask. First is, During the processing of donor's milk, is there any nutrient loss? And if yes, in which way and how can we avoid it?
That I think she explained pretty well.
Yes, ma'am, this
Anyway,
was a question asked in the beginning. And is the cholesterol levels justified in donor's milk?
I
that is
think,
also
the most
explained.
of the donor milk is given to us by mothers that have already breastfed their other infant and they have extra milk. So we almost never get colostrum as donor milk.
Yeah.
So, the breast milk is in 2 phases. You initially have colostrum, and then you move on to mature milk after about 2 weeks. And I think that that's just something that, is slightly different. I have a slide in there, which I hope you'll get as to the reduction in different components. There is, as I said, a very large reduction in fat because of, not just the processing with the heating and cooling, but also in the changing of containers, and the breast milk fat sticks to the containers. And again, we don't tend to use glass anymore, which is actually better for storing breast milk. Every time we use plastic, we're going to get some loss of fat for breast milk.
Ma'am, there's
I
one
hope I
question.
answered that question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. There's a question. What interventions are you currently practicing for moms who have formula or donor's milk? Interventions for moms who give
formula what? I'm sorry?
Interventions for
I'm
the
sorry?
moms who give formula milk or donor's milk. Any intervention is there?
I think we really don't allow them, much of a choice. We provide either donor milk or regular milk to our mothers, to our babies, until they get to 34 weeks. And after that, we let the parents choose if they want to move on to donor milk or formula at that point. So because we believe breast milk is so important for these children, we do hit problems sometimes up front with some of our Muslim families who do not believe in donor milk, because they believe that any mother's milk, the child is then required to, take care of the person that gave them the milk, and then it puts the child with a burden for the future. And so, respecting that, we usually wait on those children until the mother's producing enough milk. And the mothers have been, they put in the extra effort to produce the extra milk. Our 2 cases of necrotizing enterocolitis in older babies, however, did come from mothers that insisted on formula at 32 weeks, and we gave in, and those babies went on to have injury to their intestines. We do have specific formulae that are designed for preterm infants, but it's still not as good as breast milk.
Yes, ma'am, definitely. Ma'am, can donor's milk be fortified after processing for minimizing the nutrient loss? I think that was also being discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you will have to figure out your own fortification, which is why I didn't provide a list of everything we use, because it may not be the list of things you use. And honestly, our dietitians really put a lot of time and effort. We work on, just trying to get the correct protein intake and the correct carbohydrates. And so I think you probably could figure out a design for your own fortifiers pretty soon. I heard that a powdered fortifier was coming to India. And some people even use, formula powder as a fortifier. And that might actually be necessary if you have preterm infant formula. You might use that as a fortifier, just that little bit extra to give you the extra protein, etc., without losing all the benefits of your breast milk.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, yeah.
And just one last question. What challenges do you face in convincing the mother for donor's milk? Is there any challenge you face?
Yes, because you have to assure them that it's clean. It's a human tissue. Here it's protected under human tissue bank laws as though it were blood. And when you present that to the mother, she starts to get worried. This is like a blood transfusion to my baby. And you talk to her about all the benefits. When you tell her about the differences of levels and things in the donor milk versus breast milk, and how her baby could possibly make it out of the NICU, 14 days earlier. Usually that gets them running towards, using the donor milk. Sure, we'll use it. And we have a lot of Hispanic mothers here, and the entire focus of the mother is, I want to feed my baby. So if you tell her we can feed your baby earlier and sooner with donor milk, then they want the donor milk, because they really want, they just want their baby to get food. That is, so, there are going to be cultural differences, of course, but I'm sure India will have its own challenges that you will overcome.
Yes, ma'am, definitely. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful session, not only highlighting us the importance of milk bank, human milk bank, as also the importance of human milk oligosaccharides in the NICU and how its impact is on the growth of the preterms. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I would now request.
Thank you, Sonia. It was a fantastic presentation. And this presentation is not enough, I would say. We need to continuously engage for a few days, maybe, to learn everything from you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thanks a lot.
I'd be honored.